Jason Furman, welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be with you.
There's really nothing to talk about in terms of the economy these days, neither in terms of the record of the Biden administration nor in terms of what's happening right now with Donald Trump. I think we'll have an interesting conversation. Before we get into it, I guess I want to step back for a moment and wonder whether we are in a change, not just of political dispensation, but of economic dispensation. It feels like there was with two genuine sides that often disagree with each other about very important things, a kind of broad policy consensus from, let's say, the 1980s until 10 or 15 years ago. The first Trump administration seemed to undermine that in a number of key ways, like tariffs. The Biden administration itself actually billed itself as economically heterodox in important ways, not just keeping those tariffs, but engaging in industrial policy and other kinds of things. And now it feels like the Trump administration possibly is pushing those things even further. Do you think we're at an inflection in our sort of economic dispensation, or do you think news of that has been oversold?
I worry that we're at an inflection. As someone that thinks that policy was not perfect prior, but was decently good and put the United States in a better place. The most visible thing and the thing that gets the most attention is trade. And you do have pretty much a free trade orientation, by and large, by presidents at least, up through Obama. That changed a lot in President Trump's first term. President Biden continued that, and now President Trump is, quadrupling or quintupling down on the break from trade. But I think it's not just trade. I think it's a general sense that there's something, annoying about economists and their trade-offs and their budget constraints and the unintended consequences and all the things they want you to think through in lots and lots of different domains of policy, and instead embracing a certain populism or political approach to policy making rather than a technocratic style.
Great. I want to get back deeper into that question, but I thought we'd sort of preview that part of the conversation, then perhaps it makes sense to actually dive into what that means concretely. The Biden administration thought of itself as in some ways deviating from what it sort of described as orthodox or neoliberal economics. And the hope was to bring a lot more manufacturing back to the United States, to increase the wages, especially of less affluent Americans. And obviously in the sort of last years of the Biden administration, there was a big debate about the extent to which it succeeded. A lot of the messaging from Democrats was the economy is going amazingly, and it's only because the media ecosystem is hostile to us or because voters are somehow ungrateful that we're not recognizing all of the things that we've done for the country. You've recently published an article in Foreign Affairs that is, really quite pessimistic about the record of the Biden administration. Tell us a little bit about sort of how the Biden administration thought that it was going beyond neoliberal orthodoxy, as it described it, and how its policies worked out.
Yeah. So first of all, let me just say, we'll get to the Trump administration. I think they're much worse, but I don't think that means one shouldn't also dive into and try to understand the mistakes that in some ways brought us to this place with Donald Trump, and that I would love to see corrected in the future. And I think it is perfectly possible to have a two-track conversation. And my hope is that, Yascha, you and I will model that in our discussion here. The second thing to say is the United States does have really strong, economic assets. We have tremendous productivity growth. We have a really successful tech industry. Immigration has been a very, very mixed thing politically for the United States, but economically it has been a real blessing as well, and one needs to wrestle with how to get the best of the economics while minimizing the worst of the politics. So there's a number of good things there. But when you look at both the goals that the Biden administration set, the way they went about those goals, and for me, almost it bothers me the most the way they talked about how they went about those goals. I think there were a whole set of issues. So, one goal was to run the economy really hot. And that was an explicit goal to downplay the risk of inflation, upplay employment. And the United States did have a rapid recovery, but all the other advanced economies had rapid recoveries too. And the United States' pace of recovery was about in the middle. It got much more inflation earlier on. Other countries did catch up in terms of inflation, but a lot of that was because they faced a much, much worse shock from the Russian invasion, which drove up natural gas prices much more in Europe and around the world than they did in the United States.
And for people who are struggling
to
for people who are struggling to recall the economics 101, when you're saying that they're aiming to run the economy hard, what was the purpose of that, and what are some of the dangers that come from running an economy hard?
Yeah, so the idea is you don't just want to get the unemployment rate back down to something like the normal unemployment rate of 4, but you want to push it even further than that. And the hope is that that will give workers greater bargaining power to get larger wage increases. And that actually worked. The problem is it also gave businesses larger power to do price increases. And so there was this race between workers doing price increases and businesses doing price increases. And for the most part, the businesses won. And real wages for several years in a row fell, which is to say that wages did not grow as quickly as inflation. And by the end, they had caught up and were a bit ahead of inflation, but only a very little bit, and much less wage growth adjusted for inflation than you had seen in the years running up to COVID.
And one of the striking facts that you point out in your Foreign Affairs article is that, as a result, yes, there was some significant nominal wage increases for people in the lower quadrants of income. And it is, in fact, true that their wage increases were faster during the Biden administration than those of the people at the top, who actually, on average, had a decrease in their wages. But in real terms, in inflation-adjusted terms, the 5 years, over 4 years of the Biden administration ended up doing less well than the 4 years just pre-COVID. So actually, the real wage increases for Americans were slower after COVID than they were before.
Yeah. And one interesting thing that a lot of people don't actually realize, and I didn't see sort of at least left Twitter where I spend too much of my time highlighting, was that starting around 2014, wage inequality started narrowing. So starting about that year, wages started growing faster for low-income workers than for high-income workers. That continued through the Trump years. Basically, every Trump year, you saw gains for the bottom relative to the top. But in 2019, there was not a lot of discussion about, we're going through this historic wage compression. Then in the last couple of years, there was a lot of discussion about this historic wage compression. In some sense, that discussion was correct, but it miscontextualized it as this thing that started on January 20th, 2021, when it started sort of towards the end of Obama, continued through Trump, and went through Biden. And just to be super clear, I'm not claiming this is like Obama turned a dial and made this happen, or the Trump turned a dial. There's a lot of different underlying economic forces, many of which economists actually haven't written about and studied enough to understand that was what was going on here.
I want to come back to the Biden administration in a moment, but I think this is actually an opportunity for a good little sidestepping. In the 2010s, there was this quite broad consensus that inequality is not just a very serious problem, but it's going to increase over time. There's obviously Thomas Piketty's claim that the returns to capital are higher than the returns to labor, and therefore, unless there's very strong government policy or a catastrophe like a war, inequality is just going to keep going through the roof. There's things like the elephant curve by Branko Milanovic, which suggested that the gains from globalization are particularly high for the richest around the globe, and particularly low for many lower income people, and including sort of at the 70th, 80th percentile, if you think of working class people in Michigan and so on, there's a sort of particular trough where it's really not helping people. And there was sort of claims by David Autor that sort of the middle of a wage distribution in America is really suffering and giving away. And it seems to me that there's been a real kind of revision of thinking about this, that that Piketty has been criticized in a number of ways. Some of his data seems to have relied on not sort of returns to billionaires, but very high increases, for example, in the prices of apartments and homes owned by upper middle class people in big cities like London and New York and Paris and so on. Milanovic updated his elephant curve, and it ended up actually showing much higher increases in incomes for less affluent people, and it was the same methodology, just new data, for more recent years. And then we have now seen in the United States, as you're saying, for about 10 years, that income seems to have been growing faster for lower income people than for higher income people. I mean, is it time to sort of unlearn all of the assumptions we had about globalization and inequality that became received wisdom over the course of the 2010s?
I think it's time to unlearn some of them, for sure. And some of the researchers in this space are biased, and they make a lot of assumptions under the hood, and they make every assumption to help support their story. And by the way, each assumption might be defensible, but it might be like a 90-10 thing, and they take the side of the 10, and that it compounds. In other cases, there's what information is presented. So you mentioned David Autor. His research at the China shock, I think, is quite good, but there's two pieces to it. One is he estimated the wage impact of the China shock, and that wage impact was actually quite small. So you could have highlighted his paper as saying it showed that the China shock did not lead to very much of an increase in inequality, but that wasn't really what was featured and taken away from it. Moreover, I think his paper was just part of the story, and it got to the role that imports played in the U.S. economy, didn't do all the benefits that came from the export side, and there's other economists like Feenstra that have told, I think, a better version of the complete story. But more broadly, yeah, if you look, there was much more inequality in the 20 years prior to 2000, increase in inequality in the 20 years prior to 2000 than there was in the 20 years after it. And there was more job turnover and dislocation in the 20 years before than after. And 2000 is an important date because that's when China, PNTR happened, when China entered the World Trade Organization. And so, yes, there are all sorts of problems, but in some ways those problems were worse before. And it's something that, by the way, I mean, this is more your thing than mine. Some of the economic explanations for populism puzzle me because, Billy Joel's lyric, we're living here in Allentown where they're shutting all the factories down, that was in 1982. So there would have been good reason for a populist to have won an election in 1980, or 1984, or 1988. In some ways, almost a better reason for them to win in those years than the more recent years, at least if all you're looking at is job location and rising inequality as your economic source of populism.
As a member of the International Union of Podcasters, one of my statutory obligations is to follow up on statements like, some researchers are biased, which is to say, which researchers are biased, Jason?
I think, the Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman data, they're really smart. They really have pioneered new ways of thinking about things that has made an important intellectual contribution. But every time they make a choice, they make it in a way that highlights additional inequality. And, I think that's an issue because if you're doing analysis or writing opinion pieces, have tons and tons of opinions. If you're creating a data set that people are widely relying on to tell us the facts about the world, I have less patience for the way in which opinion might intrude into the construction of that data set.
What are some of the examples of those kind of choices at the risk of becoming technical for a moment?
Sure. I mean, the issue is that they take income data from tax returns, but only about half of the income data shows up on tax returns. There's a bunch of income that people don't report, and they have to figure out where in the income distribution is it. Is it a plumber who's not paying his taxes or a billionaire who's not paying his taxes? And the ratio of the plumbers to the billionaires affects inequality. Another thing is a bunch of that income goes to corporations, and you need to decide, which person benefited from that corporate income. So choices they make about everything that doesn't show up on the tax returns end up affecting the numbers. And again, just to be clear, it's not fraud, and this is not, every one of the choices is defensible, but every one of them goes in the direction of taking all the income that's basically missing and that we don't observe and attributing it to people at the top of the income distribution rather than in the middle or the bottom.
I was struck by your quoting Billy Joel. I've observed that. The famous statement that if all you have, if all you have is a hammer, everything you're going to see is a nail. And I think that's often true in the social sciences, where sociologists tend to attribute the rise of populism to cultural causes, and economists nearly always tend to attribute the rise of populism to economic causes. A possible implication of you invoking that Billy Joel line and pointing out when it was written is that you're a little bit skeptical that it really is economic causes that are the main explanation of the rise of populism. Sort of, do you think there's something to this observation that, economists tend to emphasize very strongly economic causes more than other researchers in the social sciences? And do you do you think that we should give a little bit less weight to those economic causes than other economists, or would you defend the primary role of the economy in explaining this broad political transformation where we see not only in the United States but in many other developed democracies and developing democracies around the world as well?
Yeah. So I think some economists are the carpenter with the hammer, so everything looks like a nail, and they think the economic explanation. I think there's others that might have the opposite bias. Maybe if you've been involved in public policy, you don't want to be blamed for the rise of populism, so you want it to be someone else's fault, the person handling the cultural issues, so you have clean hands. So the biases go different ways. I tend to be skeptical. To be clear, I think the economy matters. So there's a lot of evidence that historically following financial crises, there is a reduction in faith in institutions. There can be a rise in populism. Same thing following very high inflation. So I think the financial crisis and the burst of inflation almost certainly affected the elections and the politics that followed. But that's a bit different than saying it's, 50 years of neoliberalism and the decline of manufacturing and the expansion of trade in China. So I'd have a role for economic stuff, but it would be more these episodes than these longer-term structural trends.
So I think we can disentangle those two things.
But tell me what you think, by the way. Okay.
Happy to do that in a second, but let me ask one more follow-up question, and you're very welcome to turn around. So you said two things in one breath there, right? Which is sort of, and that's because that's a lot of the standard story that the left tells, which is, neoliberal policies led to the decline of manufacturing, and so neoliberal policy is to blame for the rise of populism because that is sort of the causal chain. Now we can disentangle those two things, right? There's a real question about what kind of share manufacturing would have continued to have in the United States, even if you had very non-neoliberal policies. And of course, in some ways, many of those companies may have failed if you'd had, extremely strong rules protecting unions and pushing up wages and so on. In the same way, a lot of the loss of manufacturing is due to automation and other technological factors rather than to trade with China, right? So sort of taking neoliberal policy out of it for a moment, do you not think that there has been a very significant transformation where, high school graduates with strong mechanical skills could command very comfortable wages and had relatively stable lives? And because of the decline of manufacturing, it's become much, much harder for high school graduates to both have a middle-class income, supposedly, and to have the kind of stability, the kind of certainty about their own economic future that they might have felt in the 70s and 80s. Perhaps, as your Billy Joel quote indicates, that is kind of a caricatured version of a golden age that never really existed. But what role do you think, the objective decline of manufacturing as a share of the U.S. economy, and particularly as a share of the jobs of Americans, has played in this?
Yeah. So I do think, compared to 50 years ago, inequality is higher. There is less of an ability for somebody without a college degree to command a real wage premium. There's less of an obvious pathway for people using manual skills to have a high-paid job. So I absolutely agree with all of that. What I was questioning and thought was quite important was the timing of that. That has been a process that's been going on continually. As you said, I think it has more to do with technology, much, much more to do with technology than it has to do with trade. It's something you see in countries with large trade surpluses have also seen big declines in manufacturing employment. I think it's something that no politician has figured out how to stop. Donald Trump and Joe Biden emphasized manufacturing much more than their predecessors, but you didn't really see a dent made in the employment share in manufacturing. But then also importantly, I do think that if there is a golden age, maybe it was like in the 1950s and 1960s, and it was pretty much gone by the 1980s. So what I was questioning was the timing. It's not like the pace of the increase in inequality has picked up, the pace of the dislocation has picked up, the pace of the manufacturing job loss has picked up. In fact, a number of those different things have actually gotten better or less bad in the last 25 years than in the 25 years before them.
Yeah, and I think one of the strange things about the story that is sometimes told about the kind of rise of quote-unquote neoliberal policy is that it makes it, and I have a bias towards that myself as somebody trained originally in intellectual history, it makes it out to be purely a matter of ideas, right? Like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan came in, and they were relying on the bad ideas of people like Hayek and so on, and then they transformed our political economy. And this is really coming out of nowhere in the material world, and there was no serious problems that anteceded it. But of course, when you look at the 1970s in the United States, and especially in the United Kingdom, those were economically very troubled decades. And a lot of the post-war settlement that worked very well in the 1950s and 1960s was starting to come apart, as it seems. And then you can have sort of different opinions about the extent to which the reaction to that by people like Thatcher and Reagan was the right one. Perhaps there would have been a better one that was different. But to sort of pretend that we could have gone on with what the economic dispensation had been before them without very significant changes is, I think, not taking seriously both how bad the 1970s were economically and what the very genuine economic and budgetary constraints were at the time when those people entered the political scene.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with you on any of that.
Let's get back to Biden. So the Biden folks come in, as you were saying, sort of convinced that there is this rapid rise in inequality. There was the consensus in the 2010s, convinced that there had been this sort of 40-year neoliberal consensus, and perhaps that was at the root of some of the underlying problems, including the rise of populism and so on. And what we're going to do is run the economy hard, do industrial policy, increase manufacturing. One of the obvious ways that story went wrong is the rise of inflation. You spoke a little bit to this earlier, but how big a share of the blame of a rise in inflation in the United States did the Biden administration have, and why did it not take concerns about what what inflation might do to the economy, and to the prospects of ordinary Americans, and to the electoral prospects of the Democratic Party more seriously than it did?
Yeah. Look, I mean, first of all, the world was uncertain in the beginning of 2021. COVID was surging, so you don't fully understand what's going on, and no one did. We'd had a couple decades without any serious inflation problems. So you can understand a little bit how this happened. In terms of the share of blame, peak inflation in 2022 was absolutely heavily exacerbated by Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and what it did to things like oil and wheat prices. But by 2023, we still had a lot of inflation, even though the oil price increases had fully reversed. And by that point, I think almost the entire elevation in inflation was the result of the overly expansionary policies that were not just pursued in 2021, where things were really confusing. But let's remember, in the summer of 2022, when inflation was roaring, they unilaterally canceled about $500 billion of student debt in a way that was not at all authorized in the law. The Supreme Court eventually blocked it, and then they found partial ways around that. But $500 billion, that's an enormous, enormous sum of money.
And of course, ironically, that policy is not redistributive, but rather the inverse, right? Given that on average, people who graduate from college make better wages and more affluent than those who don't, this was actually an upward economic redistribution.
Yes, it's an upward economic redistribution. It was macroeconomically horribly timed. It wasn't legal. And, this isn't my expertise, but it sent a message that we're the party of not just college students, but by the way, a lot of beneficiaries of it would have been law students, business school graduates, medical school graduates. They're some of the people with the very highest debt, and they were included in it. So it sent a message about, who the Democratic Party was fighting for, and maybe it's not the message that they most would have liked. So you did that. The Inflation Reduction Act, the original version of it actually was deficit reducing up front from the very beginning, but then in Congress it got changed, and everything that cost money got pulled forward, and everything that saved money got pushed back. And so in the first 5 years, it also added a lot to the deficit, as did the infrastructure and CHIPS bills, which were not really paid for. So you had multiple pieces of legislation that were upfront adding to the deficit, administrative actions, all following up on the initial round of enormous stimulus, and that propelled inflation up through the end of Biden's term.
One of the striking things you say in your article is that Biden was the first Democratic president, I forget the exact time it was, since the beginning of the 20th century or since the New Deal or something like that, that
100
didn't
years.
add, in 100 years, that didn't add a permanent feature to the American welfare state. What is it that Biden did do to improve conditions for poorer Americans? Why did that prove to be temporary? That really is a very striking indictment, right? That an administration that comes in saying we're going to end the era of orthodox neoliberal economics, not only ends up with less of an increase in real wages than Americans had prior to the pandemic, but not actually helping to sort of complete the American welfare state. But in important ways, if you think of things like child credits and child benefits that are standard across Western European economies, or generous parental leave policies and so on, lags significantly behind those our developed economies.
Yeah, so partly this is not his fault. This is the fault of Republicans who didn't want to pass things like an expanded refundable child tax credit. But I do think there is a sense in which either it's his fault or the fault of the movement that he represented. He advanced to Congress a plan called Build Back Better that had two halves. One was the American Jobs Plan, and that was about stuff, microchips, infrastructure, building climate-related things. The other was the American Families Plan. That was about people, paid leave, child credit, child care, etc. The first one passed, largely intact. The second one, not a piece of, passed. I think some of that reflected his prioritization. Some of that reflected congressional and Joe Manchin prioritization. And it ended up, though, what really bothered me, being rationalized by people that said, we don't need to do, these things for children because we're creating millions of jobs and we're rebuilding manufacturing and we're transforming the economy. You see that in climate change. Rather than, and this I don't blame them because you couldn't have done it politically, but rather than doing a carbon tax and then redistribute the proceeds, there's this sense of like, oh, we'll just create green jobs and that will help people through the transition. Well, at best, a couple 100,000 people will get green jobs, maybe 1 million. By the way, a bunch of other people will lose jobs. So I think the net is zero. But at the best case, you're talking a very small number of jobs. Infrastructure, small number of jobs. Manufacturing, I think there were basically no jobs. There's not a lot of people being hired to work in microchip factories in hard hats. But so I think it sort of was a category mistake to think that you had tools that were large enough on so-called pre-distribution that you didn't need to continue to emphasize and obsess over what economists would call redistribution, but people in the political system have politer names for.
It's interesting that you mention Joe Manchin. He was obviously a huge point of contention during the Biden administration because he was one of the key senators needed to pass a lot of those economic bills, and he was quite recalcitrant about them. One answer to those criticisms is to say that he's the best Democratic senator that Democrats will ever get from the state of West Virginia, at least in the foreseeable future. And so his value above replacement is extremely high for Democrats because now that he's retired from the Senate, there obviously is a Republican senator from West Virginia, and that senator is not even going to entertain any of the kind of bills that Biden was trying to get through. I'm more interested, though, in the substantial question. What points was Manchin right on and what points was he wrong on? Do you think that he, on some points, pushed the Biden administration towards better policy, or do you think that on the whole, the criticisms of Manchin's substantive positions were correct and he foiled things that would have been right and important?
Yeah, I think he got one really big thing right, which is the version of Build Back Better that emerged from the House was a massive, massive deficit increase in the first couple of years that would have taken inflation up, a lot more than it actually went up. Part of what happened was the House took some of the Biden proposed tax increases and scaled them back. And then they were completely incapable of prioritizing. They couldn't say, we want to help families. What's the most important thing? They included everything for every caucus from the House. And Joe Manchin looked at that and he balked. And I think the country and the party is lucky that he balked on that. So that I think he got absolutely right. What I wished he had pivoted to was saying correctly, you can't do all 8 of these things. So let's do this one thing. Probably refundable child tax credit would have been my top priority. So, in some sense, he was 90% right in deleting things. But unfortunately, he deleted 100% of things rather than just what I would have preferred, which was 90.
That's very interesting. Now, I've been thinking.
And by the way, another important thing he was right on was, by the way, which is I think an important part of this, and it's been a theme in a recent book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, which is the importance of permitting reform and building. It's not just the amount of dollars you put, but it's all the obstacles. That's especially true for things like electrical transmission lines, which have to take the electricity from where the wind and sun makes it to where people need to use it. And those are, extremely difficult to build. And he had a permitting reform that the White House ostensibly supported, but, was never able to get through that would have made a real difference.
There's been a lot of talk about permitting. There's a great viral clip in which Ezra Klein explains some of the kind of permitting process of Build Back Better to Jon Stewart, and Jon Stewart sort of absolutely loses his mind over it. There's also a broader question about the kind of abundance agenda that parts of the broadly Democratic coalition have now been pushing intellectually for about 10 years, and obviously it's been in the conversation a lot with the recent publication of Ezra Klein's and Derek Thompson's book, Court Abundance. How big a part of the substantive solution and how big a part of the communication solution do you think that set of policies is? Can Democrats reinvent themselves by saying we are the party that actually recognizes that government is too constrained in being able to build things, that private individuals are too constrained in being able to build things, and we're going to be the party that pushes for a lot of new housing, a lot of new infrastructure, a lot of renewable but very cheap energy. Does that give a big part of a substantive answer to how to make Americans more prosperous in the future? And do you also think that that can be part of a kind of Democratic Party rebranding exercise, which helps the party, beat whoever Trump runs in 2028 and sort of build a more coherent electoral majority over time?
So I have no doubt that this abundance agenda is a very important part of governing and governing better in the future. It might even be an important part of getting reelected by showing that you're getting results and doing things for people. I have no doubt that while lots and lots of people have known lots of pieces of it, it has not been prioritized in the way it needs to be. And their book and this broader movement, I think, will help that prioritization. As a substantive matter, it's definitely only one tool in the kit. There's a lot of other things that are needed. And that's not a criticism of anyone. I don't think there's anyone who argues that this is all that's needed. On the political side, I said it might help with your re-election if you get results. With your election, I'm not entirely sure. I think the piece of it that I'm the most sympathetic to is that it presents an optimistic, positive-sum vision of the world, which, notwithstanding some of the success of Donald Trump and some of the negativity, I do think at its heart is a deeply patriotic, deeply American, and should be central to anything. In terms of the specifics, going out and giving lots of speeches about zoning reform, that's how you get my vote. I'm not sure how many other people, that's how you get their vote.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about this, and I think I roughly share that assessment, which is to say that substantively, the difficulty of doing something simple like building high-speed rail, between Los Angeles and San Francisco is just a huge drag on the U.S. economy. Our inability to build housing, even in many very desirable rural places, that are hubs of economic opportunity and that are wonderful places to live, but where it's so difficult to construct any kind of housing that it's incredibly expensive to live there. Not to speak of places like New York City and San Francisco, etc., is a huge drag on the economy. And I do buy the story that one of the reasons for the recent conservative tilt in American public opinion is that red states have been governed much better than blue states, which both has led to people looking at those states and saying, well, perhaps Republicans have something right if Texas seems to be working better in many ways than California is. And also just through the effect of growing those states, making more Americans move to places that already have a kind of more conservative-leaning political consensus. And rather than turning those states blue, what seems to have happened is that it turned people who moved to those states more red and more conservative. I think I'm slightly skeptical about how important a place this can play in political rhetoric, both for the reason that you outlined, that somebody like Barack Obama didn't talk about permitting reform. He talked about a grand vision for what he wanted America to look and feel like, and that's what earned him those huge crowds in his first presidential run. A lot of the time, this is going to be too technocratic. Secondly, I think it's going to be hard for Democrats to have credibility on this. I think even a Democratic presidential candidate who talks about this is going to take real time for people to believe that he's going to be willing and deliver on this kind of agenda, and that's probably better done in government than it is on the campaign trail. And third, because in purely electoral term, I worry that this sort of NIMBYist instinct is very, very strong. On substantive terms, I'm completely on the YIMBY side. As a piece of electoral strategy, I'm just struck by the extent to which, even in perhaps particularly people who are sort of left-leaning and progressive in all kinds of ways, cry murder the moment that there's any kind of proposal for expansion in what they do. I'm visiting a friend in Jackson, Wyoming, as we're recording this conversation, and I heard about Wilson, Wyoming, one of the most affluent and one of the most liberal-leaning places in a very red state in Wyoming. And there was apparently a proposal to build a stretch of sidewalk in this town. Just one stretch of small sidewalk to connect a few of the businesses in that town, and there was a huge rebellion against this because it would supposedly, end the rural character of Wilson, Wyoming, home of more billionaires per capita than probably anywhere else in the United States, and there's no sidewalk until this day. So this instinct, I think, politically is very strong. You have you're an avid Goodreads reviewer. You once very kindly reviewed my book, The People versus Democracy, on Goodreads. You recently reviewed abundance, and one of the parts of your review went a little bit viral on social media, where you're talking about the idea that it's exaggerated to say that personnel matters and that really determines everything that happens in government, but that often Republicans end up being able to better deliver, for example, in state welfare policy agencies, because they're more likely to hire people with business experience. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is something I've observed a number of times, but I cited a friend of mine who has worked very closely with state welfare agencies in dozens of states and cities across the country for probably 20 years now. And, his version was, in a Democratic state, you take someone that ran the local nonprofit and they're like a do-gooder and they're really well-intentioned and they're a wonderful person, and you put them in charge of a big complicated bureaucracy, and they don't always do such a great job. In a Republican state, you may not have the most bleeding heart policies, but when it comes to hiring, you're more likely to do actually a national search, not just a local search. You're more likely to get someone who's had some success in business in the past, and then they're just better able to manage and deliver the services effectively for people. So that's just one type of government, and what's striking there is that's the type of government you'd think Democrats would care the most about. They're the people that care about people. Republicans, they don't care about people. They hate people. It's not what I think, by the way, but I'm just saying that's a certain impression. If you care about people, you probably want someone from the business community who knows what they're doing to execute on your policies. And by the way, this does relate back, I hate to keep harping on the Biden administration, but it relates back to them too. They had very few people with substantial business experience there. And some of that was, certain senators like Elizabeth Warren really objecting to anyone. Once upon a time, Goldman Sachs was a great credential for government. Now it's become a no-go thing. I think some of that's fine, and maybe you don't want, all of finance controlling everything, but it went way, way, way far. So I knew people who had worked for Google who couldn't get jobs that were totally unrelated to the tech sector because they had worked for Google. And that's just not the way to have the very best talent running your government.
All right, part of the art of podcasting is to keep people in suspense, and I'm sure a lot of listeners have been kept in suspense throughout this conversation about what's going on economically right now and what your views are of the emerging economic policy of the Trump administration. To start with a general question, is there any coherence to it? Is there any kind of animating logic that connects all the different parts of Trump's economic policy? Or is it a kind of incoherent bundle of instincts that doesn't really fit into a coherent whole?
There was an attempt to make a coherent whole of it by a guy named Steve Mirren, who's a very good economist. He's now chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, the job that I had under President Obama. And back in November, he wrote something called The User's Guide to Restructuring the International System, a title very close to that. And he came up with this sort of economically coherent version of across-the-board tariffs and redoing the entire global order. The only problem was that his coherent plan required the United States to control the policies of every other country in the world. So he said, we're going to do these tariffs, and we're going to make military threats to stop other countries from having retaliatory tariffs.
Oh, okay. Well, that's easy to do.
These and exactly. We're going to do this. And yes, you might worry what it does to U.S. interest rates and the U.S. dollar, but don't worry. We are going to force all the other countries in the world to basically swap the money they lent us for much lower interest rate 100-year debt. And so, it's a little bit like saying, I have this great plan to help the United States. Step one is take over Canada. it might be true that if you took over Canada, it would help the United States. I think probably not. I don't really like the imperial conquest. But anyway, it's just not going to happen. And so, this attempt to, put lipstick on a pig or, do something coherent, I think in some ways just shows how utterly incoherent it is. Because the conditions you'd have to believe, it's almost like, in economics, sometimes theory is useful because it says, here's what you need to believe in order for this proposition to be true. And it says, oh, wait, those conditions are just so ridiculous. I don't even believe the proposition anymore. So I think it's an incoherent mess.
In my one very brief stint working as a management consultant one summer, we were supposed to develop a new business line for this business that we were consulting. And halfway through the project, we had a meeting with the CEO, and the senior partner asked the CEO something along the lines of, how much annual revenue would this line of business have to bring in for you to actually consider pursuing it? And the CEO said something along the lines of $1 billion. And by our estimates, the most that could possibly come for this business line was $100 million. And we should have stopped the project right there. But instead, what happened is that we relabeled all of our slides what you'd have to believe, and assumed that this business would be able to capture 80% of some imaginary market. What you'd have to believe is often a good exercise in pointing out how impossible it is. Even for the more honest thing is to say this is not going to work. So there is a kind of blueprint that you are pointing to about how this would all kind of work. It was never going to work because all these other countries weren't going to go along with what it required. What elements of that blueprint are actually being put in place? I mean, is sort of what's happening some kind of piece-by-piece version of that blueprint, or is the actual policy that Trump pursuing nearly wholly unrelated to that blueprint?
It's only partly related to that blueprint. I mean, first of all, there is a perfectly coherent idea that we need to take the threat from China more seriously. And in the first Trump term, that's largely what he did. I don't think it was the best designed tariffs on China. It focused too much on things that consumers cared about. His goal was too much reducing the trade deficit by getting them to buy more stuff. But at least it was sort of pointing into the right direction, even if it didn't get the exact target correct. Canada, though, that's just sort of nuts. Economically, as a country to focus on, geopolitically, as a country to focus on, and by the way, it will hurt, not help, our efforts to really build a coalition and build support to take on some of the really important issues around China. So the prioritization of all of this has been, just downright bizarre from the perspective of economics, from the perspective of geopolitics, and maybe can only be understood with sort of grievance politics and personal pique, rather than any coherent theory beyond that.
Yeah, and I've been struck by what seems to be the personal animus against Canada and against Europe in much of the administration's public communications, and I was very struck by it, and I wrote about it in some of, particularly J.D. Vance's private comments in that leaked Signal messaging group. I understand that Americans are frustrated in the European case with the fact that Europeans don't spend enough in the military and don't make enough of a military contribution to NATO. That is something that Barack Obama was frustrated by, that Joe Biden was frustrated by. That is perfectly reasonable. I don't share, but I at least find I can understand the structure of a thought when people like J.D. Vance seem to think that the natural political allies in Europe are the populist far right, and so they have these ideological bones to pick with the more moderate political parties that are governing in Europe. I don't agree with it, but I get the logic of where it comes from, and they're probably right that politically we're closer to those right-wing populist parties than to center-right parties like the Christian Democrats in Germany. But somehow they seem to have an animus against many of America's traditional political allies that goes beyond either the kind of rational concern about free riding or the sort of ideological preference for more extreme parties. Those two things don't quite seem to add up to what is driving that administration's policy. So, why is it that they're picking these tariff fights with Canada or with the European Union? Is there any economic logic behind it? Do you think it comes from that ideology, from animus? I mean, what's your best attempt at explaining it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, just economically, almost every forecaster has marked their growth down by about half a point, which is $1,000 a household. It's real money. They've marked inflation up by about half a point. Consumer confidence has plunged. Business uncertainty is higher than any time except the pandemic. I mean, rarely have I seen just someone come in and just make a set of decisions that turned everything so rapidly on a dime. And the auto one is a good example. If we wanted a larger auto industry in the United States and we were willing to have American consumers pay higher auto prices, there is a policy that could accomplish that. I wouldn't think that was a good policy because I think it would be, like $1 million of cost for every extra auto job saved or something like that. But if you wanted to pay $1 million per auto job saved, you could do it.
What would that policy be? Just to help us understand.
Yeah. That would largely be on the vehicles themselves, but it would try not to interfere with the supply chain. And so the parts that are coming from Canada and Mexico, they're critical to the success of the U.S. auto industry and our ability to make cars. And so you'd be much smarter about, how to exempt those. You probably wouldn't want to raise the price of steel in the way they have, which is adding to the cost of cars. So it's all the things that are making it harder to be part of this integrated market. I mean, Europe doesn't make cars in one country. It has integrated supply chains largely within Europe. Same thing in Asia. They have supply chains within Asia. Well, how do we make cars in America? We have a supply chain with Canada and Mexico. So starting by blowing that up, and by the way, we're still allowing, although I assume I guess we just changed it. But at first, we were allowing cars to come in, tax-free from Korea while taxing them from Canada and Mexico. So I don't even think this is a good strategy to protect American auto jobs.
Tell me a little bit more broadly about tariffs, how economists think about tariffs, and in what kind of circumstances they might be justified. One of the basic idea for why they're bad is comparative advantage, and the basic economics 101 theory of why if you specialize and the other country specializes, you end up having more overall product, and you can trade so that each comes away with a benefit. There's a very poor explanation of comparative advantage, but listeners will get the point. One of the dangers of that, of course, is that if other countries have a very strong comparative advantage in manufacturing relative to you, then that has a number of negative consequences, one of which is connected to national security. So if you're suddenly no longer producing any steel at home, if you're perhaps one day no longer producing any military equipment, as is the case in many European countries, if you're not producing some of the most advanced microchips, then you become very vulnerable to a situation in which you may no longer be able to import those, and that is a sort of risk of national security, right? The other risk, you might say, is one of political economy. That it might be really important, and this goes back to our conversation about the causes of populism, to have a certain set of manufacturing jobs, because that is a good, important, valuable thing for people who have strong manual skills, but perhaps have less strong academic skills, to be able to do. And if all of those jobs go away, you might end up with a whole segment of a population that struggles to find productive economic employment. How should we balance the importance of comparative advantage against some of those concerns of national security and some of those concerns about how to shape a political economy that actually is going to deliver high quality jobs for people? And in the current political environment, what kind of tariffs do you think that might justify, and what kind of tariffs does that not justify?
Yeah, so I think the national security consideration is a really important one and is a good reason to deviate from an orthodox economic prescription. your broader political economy good jobs, I think is not. So let me explain both of those. On the national security one, yes, I'd like us to make advanced microchips in the United States. I don't want us to sell missiles to China. You can then debate things like electric vehicles and solar panels, whether you want to make them ourselves or get them more cheaply from China. I think there's a trade-off there. But with national security, yes. Now, the way to think about it in national security, though, is to admit it's a trade-off. If you're kidding yourself into thinking that you have a great way to make much cheaper, better EVs in the United States than we're getting from China, and so it's win-win, we get more jobs, better electric vehicles, and more national security, you're just kidding yourself. So the argument that appeals to me is yes, EVs are going to be X dollars more expensive. By the way, we're not going to get any net new jobs, really, because of the reasons I'll talk about in a moment. But it's worth it for our national security because China has a kill switch or because of whatever, and here's how much that costs. So when you're weighing that trade-off, I think it's largely the economic cost of restricting trade against the national security benefits, and in some cases, national security wins. That's not to say it always wins. When it's something like Nippon Steel taking over U.S. Steel, people invoke national security, and I think that was a completely tendentious and ridiculous rationale. On your second, the political economy one, the problem is I just don't think trade policy can do that. Trade policy can help one industry. Maybe it can help 2 or 3 industries. It can't help them all simultaneously. And the issue is if you help steel workers, you make steel more expensive. That hurts auto workers and it hurts construction workers because they use steel. If you protect in one segment of your economy, it tends to strengthen your exchange rate because you need less foreign currency to buy foreign stuff. That weakens the foreign currency. It strengthens your exchange rate. That makes it harder for exporters because your things are more expensive when you're selling them around the world. And so you're helping the industry you're protecting, but the industry you're not protecting now effectively has almost like a tax on its exports. You also make intermediate inputs more expensive in a way that I talked about, but machinery that's used to make stuff more expensive. And you get retaliatory tariffs against your industries. You get other countries being poorer and they're not buying as much of your stuff. And so I'm very, very skeptical that any of these trade policies can help industry writ large as opposed to can help a particular industry that you've chosen for national security reasons where the benefits outweigh the costs of protecting it.
I tried on this podcast a few weeks ago to get somebody to steelman the case for tariffs. And so I had Oren Cass on the podcast. And one of the arguments that he made is that economists often favor value-added taxes. That in general, economists tend to think that one of the most efficient ways to tax people is something that is akin to a general sales tax. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's a good way of thinking about it for people who don't know much about economics. And his argument was that, well, tariffs are just like a VAT, just like a general sales tax, except that you have an exception for domestic industries, right? You're just charging that VAT on goods that come from abroad. You're not doing so for domestic goods, but other than that, it's exactly like a VAT. So how can it be, he asked, that the VAT is the favored tool of economists in one context, but then economists are so uniformly against tariffs in the other context? What do you make of the argument? What would your response to that argument be?
Yeah, Oren, unfortunately, is just deeply, deeply confused when he's making that argument. And there's 2 basic problems that are wrong with it. First of all, in taxes, you generally want to have the broadest tax base so you can have the lowest tax rate possible. Consumption is 70% of the economy. That's the base of a VAT. I mean, you sometimes carve things out of it, but that's the maximum base of a VAT. Goods imports to the United States are about 10% of GDP. So right there off the bat, you need a 7 times higher tax rate on imports than you would need on a VAT. And by the way, that's not taking into account all the behavioral responses and the like. So it sort of violates the standard notion of broader base, lower rate. But more importantly, It violates the notion that you don't want taxes to act as a distortion that say do X, not Y, unless there's a very good reason for it, like national security or pollution or something like that. And a VAT is neutral. It says every type of good, whether it's domestic or foreign produced, gets taxed the same. A tariff is very non-neutral. It puts a thumb on the scale of buying domestic. Now, maybe that sounds good to you. Great, we're buying domestic. A tariff also effectively is like a tax on your exports, too. It's a weird economic notion, but when you rechannel things from to domestic production, you're basically drawing from exports. The exchange rate is a channel by which this operates. And so with a tariff, you're not just taxing the stuff that's made abroad, you're taxing the stuff that's made in the United States and sold abroad. And so now what you've done is not really reduce the trade deficit, but you've reduced the volume. You have less exports, less imports, and that probably means you have worse jobs and higher prices.
We mostly focus so far on trade policy, but of course there's other aspects to the economic policy of a Trump administration. One of the sort of interesting questions in the background to me is that there's some people who are trying to rationalize the Trump movement, who are trying to give it some kind of intellectual coherence, who are talking in terms of constructing a coalition of a multiracial working class. And in purely electoral terms, the Republican Party does seem to some extent to be on the way towards that. Certainly it is now the case that the more affluent you are and the more affluent your region in which you live, the more likely you are to vote for Democrats. And of course, Trump did get elected in 2024 in part because he was able to increase his share of the vote among ethnic minority groups, including particularly Latinos. There is a real question, though, about whether the economic policies of the Trump administrations are going to reflect that ambition in any particular way. And the key question here is also about the budget. From what we see so far in terms of budgetary policy, is the Trump administration actually doing anything to turn this idea of a multiracial working class coalition into reality? Or does it govern in the interest of, big business and special interests?
There may be some symbolism, in fact, more symbolism than we've seen in the past. The no tax on tips, the no tax on Social Security benefits, the no tax on overtime, they seem quite intent on doing some versions of all of those. And they have mentioned quite a number of times getting rid of the carried interest tax break, which isn't a lot of money. It's about $2 billion a year, but it is egregious. And it's something that we tried to get rid of under President Obama and failed. Joe Biden tried to get rid of it and he failed. And if Trump can actually do it, the symbolism of that $2 billion a year goes well beyond a lot of other things. It's not like I can tell you, a tax loophole that George Bush closed that I remember off the top of my head in some type of vivid way. So
just explain to us quickly what
there.
The carried interest tax break is.
It says that if you run a hedge fund or private equity company or venture company, that you're effectively taxed at a lower rate. Rather than treating your work like something that should be taxed at income tax, you take a bunch of that compensation, transform it into capital gains, and then it faces a lower capital gains tax rate. And people across the political spectrum, like Greg Mankiw, who was the CEA chair for President Bush, think it's a loophole that should be closed. So it just, and you'd shorthand it as you're getting rid of a tax loophole for hedge fund managers. So you have these things that are symbolic, and I think probably will matter politically if they happen, but that's not where the bulk of the dollars are. The bulk of the dollars in extending the tax cut really is regressive. It goes more to people at the top. You have senators who have really dialed up getting rid of the estate tax. I don't think they'll do that, but it's within the realm of possibility. And then you'll have a real debate within the Republican Party that will be interesting to watch over Medicaid cuts. It's a program that it originally was sort of more favored by Democrats, But with 70 million people receiving those benefits right now, at a minimum, you can say there's an awful lot of Republicans that get them and an awful lot of Democrats. And there's some ways of telling the story in which it's disproportionately some of these Republican voters, or at least Republican shifters, that really count on that program.
How deep is the trouble that we're in economically at this moment? You start to hear murmurings about the R word, about a potential recession around the corner. But of course, as the famous phrase goes, economists have successfully predicted 17 out of the last 3 recessions. There has been some amount of market correction over the last weeks and months, but stocks are still valued very highly. The correction has not, gone so deep as to bring on an immediate recession, or it hasn't been a stock market plunge. Do you think that we risk a real chance of a recession around the corner? How should we think about the prospect of the American economy in the next months?
The risk has certainly gone up, but as you pointed out, economists have a bad track record in this regard. And here's the issue, and here's why it's hard to know. Prior to Trump, people thought the economy would grow at about 2.5% this year. It's a little bit slower than it grew in the last couple of years, in part because there were some temporary things that led that to about 2.5%. If you mechanically take everything Trump has done and is likely to do and put it in a model, if cars cost 25% more, how many fewer do people buy? If auto parts cost this much more, how much does auto production in the United States go down, et cetera? You'd be hard pressed to get a number that would reduce growth by more than a percentage point. So 2.5 to 1.5. And a recession is sort of negative, give or take. I mean, there's a more technical definition. Let's say negative. So you don't get all the way there. What we don't know, though, super well, is all the uncertainty. It's a record or near record amount of uncertainty, depending on how you measure it. And we're not just uncertain, we're uncertain about how much the uncertainty matters. Consumers say they're really, really, really pessimistic. Does that mean they're going to stop going to restaurants and hunker down at home, saving all their money in case the recession is about to come? Or is that just something they're telling pollsters because they don't like all the noise, but it's really disconnected from any actual economic behavior? And that's what we don't know. So the thing that could cause a recession, if it happens, will be all this intangible uncertainty and pessimism. And there's just not some historical regularity that lets us quantify the consequences of that.
In many ways, your Foreign Affairs article on Bidenomics was a very depressing read, since well-intentioned people came into office trying to do good things, and you make a pretty compelling case that they ultimately failed to do so on many of the most important counts. In one kind of sense, I found the article to be optimistic, which is to say that often some political scientists, and I think many political analysts and observers say, lol, nothing matters. What you do in government doesn't actually determine your electoral chances. Insofar as the economy matters, it's really out of your hand. It depends on whether there happens to be a global recession or there happens to be some kind of big global growth spurt. You make, I think, quite a compelling case that a few bad policy choices ended up not just unfortunately harming the economy, but also unfortunately harming Biden's re-election chances. And again, though I don't like that outcome, in a sense, that's a kind of optimistic vision of a world, right, where good government can be rewarded and bad government can be punished by voters, and there's a kind of rationality to the whole thing. Would you apply that? How broad is that lesson? How generally do you think that holds? Or was that sort of owed to the specific circumstances of the Biden administration? And to what extent would you apply that to the Trump administration? I'm in a lot of spaces where people worry about what Trump is going to do and how it's possible to contain some of the attacks on the rule of law and other things that are coming from the Trump administration as well. And I am quite convinced by the argument that Trump's approval rating matters a lot, that it's easier to resist executive overreach when the president has an approval rating of 35% than it is when the president has an approval rating of 46-ish%, which is, I think, roughly where they are at the moment, and certainly more easy than if they had an approval rating of 55%. But I'm a little bit unsure about the extent to which the flaws in Trump's economic policy you've pointed out are going to translate into real pain for Americans, which of course I do not wish for them to suffer, and is then going to translate into some kind of electoral penalty. How plausible is the theory that I've heard from a lot of people that, what's going to happen is they're going to mismanage the economy, the stock market's going to crash, we're going to be in a recession, and then the whole game is going to be up for Trump. That's what's going to turn around the political situation. Do you find that, is that a realistic model of how things are going to play out? Or do you think that any damage that the Trump policies are going to make to the economy are likely to be either overshadowed by political rhetoric or so indirect that voters don't feel it directly? How should we think about this question?
Yeah, no, I mean, if you had to rank what you'd like to happen in the world, number one would be he governs wisely and we're in a new golden age. Number two is he governs unwisely and everyone realizes it and reacts negatively to it. And the worst scenario is governing unwisely and, people are, miss out on what actually happened. As a general rule, people blame presidents too much and credit them too much for developments in the economy. The last part of the Clinton administration, for example, growth was very strong. We bragged about it all the time when I worked in the Clinton administration. There weren't a whole lot of our policies we could really point to. That was .com, that was, building out the internet, et cetera. And, look, I think Clinton helped a little bit, but most of it was not him. Recently, though, under Biden, the example that you cited, really was like quite a dramatic change. I mean, when you spend $2 trillion, the world turns out to be different. It wasn't just the upfront $2 trillion followed up with more. And under Trump, same thing. I mean, we've seen a really, really big change very quickly, and it is 100% due to policy choices he's made and anticipation of policy choices that he's made. So I do hold out some hope that it is both true that the changes we see will result from him, and that people will both fairly and unfairly make that link. What gives me a little bit of pause, though, is 2 weeks ago there were a lot of liberals who saw this thing called the Atlanta Fed's GDP Now. It's their tracker of GDP growth, and it was something like -2. And they're like, oh, wow, the recession, it's happening right away. Trump caused it instantly. And really what happened was that tracker just went wrong for a bunch of technical reasons. And, I don't think we're going to see, at least in the first quarter, a big dramatic collapse like that. And so, I've been, partly because I like to read the economy correctly. I mean, mostly because I like to read the economy correctly, but a little bit partly in the back of my head, don't want people going out, in 2021, oh, inflation's transitory. And then a year later, there's still inflation. I don't want them to go out and say, like, Trump is bad because there'll be a recession. And then if there's not a recession, like, oh, wait, turns out Trump must have been good. So, have some proportion on it. If he takes a half point off GDP, that's $1,000 a household. A point off GDP, that's $2,000 a household. That's a really, really big deal, even if it's not quite the dramatic collapse of the type that we've seen in our economy in the past.
Jason Furman, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.